Right, the next thing we need to solve is how open and how closed do we want it to go? And this is where we start to use the explicit version of Factor so we can completely control that. And I'm going to set it to closed. The way I'm going to do that is I'm going to explicitly say that the factor is 0. That closes it as far as it's going to go. And I think it's a little bit too open, right? I just think it's a bit, I want to go smaller than that for the closed version of the aperture. So that means in our shape that we need to be rotating a little bit in the other direction. At the moment, we're just rotating clockwise as far as the factor is concerned. We're going from 0 to 30. But we actually want to go from a negative version. So we can use an overloaded version of rotated by explicitly saying from and to. So I can say this. From, let's say, -5 degrees to 30 degrees. And as you can see, it's just got smaller. I think I even want to go smaller than that. Let's go to 8. Okay, that's pretty good. Now we need to test how big it's getting. But before we do that, we're going to construct our orifice. And the way we do that is by adding a style that we're going to use in the form of a custom modifier on view. That's the thing that is going to essentially cut out our hole, if you like. We're going to put an inner shadow on it so it looks like it's above the aperture. And we're going to use something very similar to what we've got in this extension on shape. So I'm actually just going to copy that because it's going to need a view builder annotation. And I'm a bit lazy. And this is aperture style, like that. It's going to take a debug parameter as well. And I'm actually just going to return self in the debug state. For the alternative, I'm going to also say self, because when you're doing something like this, when you're developing an aperture, one of the advantages of using SwiftUI is that you can see what you're doing. But until we apply that custom modifier, we're not going to see anything. So let's resume and we'll go up here and under this layout guides, we'll say aperture style with a debug parameter of debug. Right. Now we should see what we're doing. This is going to consist of a circular stroke and we're going to clip a circle around that. In order to generate an inner shadow for this, there are several ways you can do it, most of which are covered in the PureSwiftUITools repository I've got. So if you want to have a look at that, I'll leave a link in the description below. We're going to use a slightly different technique on this one because we're going to use the shadow of a stroke itself. And shadows on strokes in Xcode 11 are a little bit funky, but we can use a weird trick that I discovered purely by accident to give us some reasonable looking shadows. This works on insettable shapes particularly well. And let's begin. So I'm going to use an overlay of a circle. And on that circle, I'm going to put a stroke of white with a line width of 10. Now, see that stroke there? Keep that in your minds. Watch this. I'm going to put a nice dark shadow on this of black with a radius of 3. Now look at this. See how that shadow is outside the stroke? That's useless to us as far as an inner shadow is concerned. I can't use that. For some reason this works, don't ask me why, but if you set the line width to a negative number, not only will the stroke be removed entirely, but the shadow will also be biased towards the inside of the stroke, which is exactly what we want. Watch this. If I set that to -10, then we've got a shadow exactly where we want it. It's too small, but what we can do is we can use the fact that it's an insettable shape to inset the circle by a negative amount and grow it. So I could say inset by -10. All right, so that's moved the shadow out. So we'll just get a subtle shadow coming through. And then I clip the circle like that. And there we are. A lovely looking orifice that has an inner shadow that looks like it's floating above. Let's zoom in so we can really get a good look. There we are. Very nice indeed. Now we need to sort out what's going on with the minimum and maximum aperture. Okay, so I want that minimum aperture to be smaller. The way that we do that is by changing this to say -10. I think it's going to look a little bit better, a bit smaller, maybe even 12. Yeah, okay, I like that. And now we can check the maximum aperture. So we've got the actual orifice now, so we can use the fact that we can control the factor explicitly to open up that aperture to the widest point and see if that's something that we like. So let's set that to 1. Right, so I think that's too big, okay, because we can't see any of the blades. What's the point of having an aperture if you can't marvel at the blades themselves? So let's reduce the extent. And we do that by changing 2 degrees to say 28. There we are, lovely. We can see the aperture blades, gives it a little more interest. Now we're in a position to say, well, we're animating. So we can use the implicit factor by saying it's equal to animating, like that. And now if we play this, lovely, there's our aperture, opening and closing. Wonderful. There are a few more styling things I want to do. So I want to, for example, put a background on this. Background, which is a linear gradient going from a color of white of 0.8 to a white of 0.1, and we're going to send it to the bottom trailing. We need to make sure that the Z stack is greedy, so it takes up all the space that it can. We do that like this, greedy frame. And then we're going to say, we're going to ignore all safe areas. So it really takes up the whole thing. And now because we've done that, I want the background of that to be white. Easy to do. Background, color, white. And then we're going to be calling overlay on that. Okay, wonderful. We're there. But the elephant in the room is what happens if we want to debug this thing? Right, so if we go down to our lovely debug parameter and we set that to true, what do we get? Something very unhelpful. So we can't really use this to change our shape because first of all, there are 9 blades there. Secondly, they're all offset. And thirdly, we can't really see the layout guide itself. So let's solve these one by one. If we're debugging, we only want there to be 1 blade. Easily solved. Number of blades, are we debugging? Yes. Make it 1. All right, if I resume that, we should only see 1 blade. Next thing is we want that layout guide to be obvious, so we want to get rid of the background. That means we can make the background conditional on the debug parameter, like so. Background, if not debug. Perfect. The last thing we need to do is to remove all those transformations and have the blade sitting in its neutral position. Again, this is very easy because we have a debug parameter in our shape. And what we'll do is we'll just make all these transformations conditional on whether or not we're debugging. Like this. If we're not debugging, then we'll say that G equals G transformed in that way. And look, there it is. So if we're debugging, it's reverted back to its original location with no transforms applied. We can change the shape. Let's try to do that. Let's say that we want it to be straight along this edge instead of curved. So let's say that control point 1 is equal to the top where it originated, dot top, and control point 2 is equal to where it is at the end, that tip, which is 10.8, 10,8. We've got our straight edge. We come down here. We set that to false. We've got all our blades back. It's a nice looking design. And now if we go to the And if we play, we'll probably see that it's not really opening and closing to the right extremities, if you like. Well, then we just adjust this. Okay, so we'll probably want to go out to, say, a big number like 45, maybe 46. Just a little bit bigger. All right. And then we want to come in a bit less. So maybe 0. Even more, 5. All right, that's looking pretty good to me. Maybe we'll go to 8 and 50. All right, and then we'll call it a day. Now, the other thing that you can do is you can add a little bit more visual interest to this by adding another transformation. Remember, these are very cheap to create. These transforms on these layout guides, they're just decorators around layout guides. Let's say that we want to rotate the whole thing. Rotated 90 degrees by the factor. If I play that, you know, it just has that little more interest to it because the whole thing is rotating. It looks a little bit more dynamic. You know, just explore, see what you can do with it. You won't be disappointed. It is really very easy to make incredibly complex looking animations using custom shapes and layout guides. So enjoy yourself. If you haven't seen my series on layout guides, then do check it out because it gives you an idea of what they are, how to use them, and how to fit them into your workflow. If you like this content, then smash the like button. It really does help people find the channel, and I do appreciate the support. If you want to see more of this kind of thing, consider subscribing, and that's what you'll get. If you have any comments or suggestions, please leave them below. But in the meantime, thanks for joining me. See you next time.